Okay, so today we're going to look at some of the infamous errors that have been seen over the ages. This is kind of a continuation from my two videos, one with kill screens of video games and the other with the death screens that you commonly see in operating systems. This is kind of continuing on from those two since there's been much request for more content from those two. So the first error we're going to look at is commonly seen in DOS, and it's known as the bad command or file name error. This will typically come up when you mistype something at the DOS prompt, and it will give you back this syntax error saying that it doesn't understand your command or it doesn't recognize that as a valid file name, and you'll get presented with this bad command or file name rebuted back at you by the command prompt. Looking at another error here in DOS, this is also a common error to appear like the bad command file name, and this one typically appears when accessing a bad floppy or maybe a hard disk that's damaged, and you would get presented with these three option choices of abort, retry, or fail. And now in early versions of DOS you were presented with abort, retry, and ignore, but ignore and fail did the same thing. And if you chose abort, that would just terminate that instance immediately right there and not continue on. Retry would basically do exactly as it says, try to read that data again, which normally doesn't work. And then your fail or ignore it's kind of like abort, but it allows you to still go on or move on. The next error we're going to look at goes into Windows, and in this case, particularly Windows XP, and it has to do with the remote procedure call service terminating unexpectedly. This was commonly seen when the blaster worm was going around in early 2000. Systems were getting infected by this blaster worm, and the worm would terminate the Windows RPC service. And what would happen is that you would get presented with a dialog box similar to this, and you would be given exactly 60 seconds to save your work before the system would shut down and restart. Now, there was a way to abort that shutdown if you were able to do it fast enough in the 60 seconds you had. If you opened up a command prompt and typed shutdown /A, you can abort the shutdown by that, and it will not shut down the system. However, since the RPC service has been shut down, most programs will not be able to run now because it's a required component of Windows. That's why it was shutting the computer down and restarting when it terminated. Another error that's seen in Windows, and this one's a little funny, is that when you get presented with an error dialog box and it tells you the operation completed successfully. Now, what causes this is that when an error dialog box appears, it's supposed to run a command that reads get last error. Now, if it's going too fast or something like that and you're like doing an installation or something, it may complete an operation successfully before it encountered the error after it. But because of how fast it was going, the get last error actually brings up the completed operation and puts that into the error dialog box, and that's why you get this error, the operation completed successfully. So it's a little funny and ironic when you get an error like this. Next, we have the error that deals with the BIOS post, which is the power on self-test. And this particular error has to do with the keyboard, and it's the error displayed no keyboard detected, and it tells you to press F1 to resume. Now, this is kind of comical or ironic in nature because there's no keyboard on the computer, so how do you press F1 to resume? That's the idea that people get. That's the funny part of it. But it's implying, of course, that there's no keyboard. Plug in a keyboard and then press F1 to continue booting. But that's the funny nature of the error as it is laid out. Our next error has to do with the Sinclair ZX Spectrum of the 1980s. And the Spectrum worked on the basic programming language, and if you made an error on your part typing in a command, it would reply with nonsense in BASIC to the user, which, when you think about it, is kind of insulting because it's basically telling you that you're giving it a bunch of nonsense it doesn't understand. Next, we're going to look at the Radio Shack TRS-80. It's a computer that only had 4 kilobytes of memory, and because of that, it had some serious limitations on the kind of automated responses it could give throughout its programming language back to the user, in this case particularly error messages. And so it only had 3 single words it could give you back based on what kind of input you gave it. The first one is it would say what with a question mark, and it was all in caps. There was no lowercase letters. When you would give it a command that it didn't understand, it would give you what. How is when it give an operation that it can't perform, such as dividing by 0. And the last one is simply sorry, because with the 4 kilobytes of memory, it would commonly run out of memory, and it would give you sorry because it can't do anything. Now let's start looking at some errors involved in the Unix operating system. And the first one here is kind of an intentionally made error that comes out to be humorous. And it's basically the way you use an operation and a modifier. And in this case, you ask Unix to make, which is the operation, and then love, which is the modifier. So you tell Unix to make love, and since Unix can't do that, it will reply back with make colon don't know how to make love stop. And so it just shows you some of the funny error messages you can intentionally generate with Unix based on using operations and modifiers. Our next Unix error has to deal with the reply it gives on a print job labeled LP0 on fire. And what this is LP0. The LP in that stands for line printer. And back in 1970s, 1980s, you had these line printers used in commercial businesses that could deliver about 20 pages per minute. And that's because they had a large drum in these printers that turned about 1600 to 2400 revolutions per minute. And these were large machines. And because of this, if there was paper or something that was being misaligned that rubbed against the drum, it could possibly create a fire hazard and in turn set the printer on fire. So it would give an error back to Unix, and Unix would then state that LP0 was on fire, which then would make the technician that sees that immediately go check the line printer to make sure it wasn't actually on fire. That's where that error message comes from. Continuing on with printers, if the older HP Laserjet printers, if the unit ever ran out of paper, it would display a PC load letter error on its LED display. And what this basically meant is PC was print cartridge, which is referring to the paper tray, and load means obviously to load paper, and letter is the size of the paper, so it wants you to load letter-size paper in the print cartridge. Now the funny thing about this message is because the way it reads out saying PC at the beginning, is when someone reads PC load letter, it sounds like they have to go back to the personal computer and reload the letter that they had sent to the printer to be printed. The last error I have deals with the internet, and it's the 404 not found error. And the first 4 refers to client error, and 04 is referring to not found. And in this case, it means that it was able to communicate with a server, but it was not able to find the page that you wanted to go to. But it means that it may be there in the future.